So I'll allow myself 15 minutes or maybe a little less so we can gain time. So thank you very much, everybody. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, or depending on where you are located. The purpose of this brief session is to bring together some rather diverse ideas around nonlinear dynamics. Some of these ideas are closer to neurophysiology than others, but I do hope that they will all be inspirational to some extent. Now, I'll be giving a rather informal talk, and I hope you will forgive me for that, just to introduce some ideas, some of the ideas that have been moving me over the last more than a decade in trying to study side-by-side nonlinear dynamics in analog electronic circuits and in the context of neural dynamics. So I would like to start off with the idea that inspired me, which is fairly obvious. The brain is totally unlike a digital computer. Well, of course, everybody knows it now. It wasn't as obvious a few decades ago, but I think we can change this sentence to it's totally unlike an engineered system. And why is that? It is so because there are fundamental architectural and design principle differences. In all the engineering systems that we are used to, computation happens by design using fixed architectures where we need high reliability of each element. There is a relatively limited number of redundancy in terms of the representation of information. Of course, there can be multiple copies of the same system, and parasitics and noise have to be strictly minimized. When we think of it, it couldn't be further from the situation for the brain. Epigenetics and genetics set only a rather loose starting point, as we know very well, for example, through anatomical variability. There is a huge amount of self-organization taking place and a huge redundancy in the representation of information, such as sensory stimuli. The reliability of each element is very low in the sense that the behavior of neurons is highly stochastic and neurons change and die all the time, and we have a rather high noise and error rate. Now, the key point is that not only the system withstands all these things that would be unbelievably hostile for a standard engineered system, but it actually leverages them using phenomena such as stochastic resonance. So what fascinated me was the idea that we could perhaps try to use electronics that we know today, standard analog electronics, in unusual ways that would bring us a little, just a little closer to the design principles, if I can inappropriately call them that way, that are found in brains and other biological systems. Now, let's jump for a second to the most prevalent type of AI today, neural networks, and in particular, deep neural networks. These are typically feed-forward systems, so they are devoid of intrinsic activity. The propagation of information is strictly determined by the connections, and there is no spontaneous activity. Couldn't be further from the case of the brain, where 80% approximately of the information processing and metabolic load is down to the maintenance of intrinsic activity. Now, as we know very well, and I hope you allow me anyway to make this summary, there are profound differences in terms of the energy efficiency, which further underline the huge architectural difference between these two systems. And obviously, one aspect at the level of the architecture is that standard neural networks, such as convolutional neural networks, are rather regular. Therefore, it is possible to train them relatively easily. But one of the foundations of the brain is a highly complex network topology with multiple topological properties that render it almost impossible to train such a network using algorithms that are known today. As we know very well, the definition of structural and physiological connectivity in the brain is actually quite a delicate topic, as Pedro and I discussed many times, but a simplified view would entail structural connectivity, functional connectivity intended as a sort of association of intrinsic activity between regions and neuronal populations, and effective connectivity, which could be viewed as a directed perturbative effect of the functional connectivity as a consequence of external stimuli or internal states. So the very simple target that I set to myself is to try to replicate the relationship between structural and functional connectivity using this kind of unusual electronic circuits. And why would that be interesting? Well, as we know, there is actually a rather loose relationship between these two aspects of connectivity in the brain. And the only situations where functional connectivity, intended, for example, as synchronization, maps closely onto structure are profoundly abnormal situations under general anesthesia, for example, following severe traumatic brain injury, etc., etc. Under normal physiological conditions, there is obviously a detectable association, but it is relatively weak and strongly time dependent. So I thought it could be an interesting thing to do this. I'm going to skip these ones. And I will do that. I was interested in doing that using chaotic systems. Now, as you know, chaotic systems are systems that are deterministic and can be perfectly deterministic in principle, yet generate very complex temporal trajectories. And that is despite them being structurally very simple. Here we have the example of a mechanical system, the double pendulum. Now, the reason, however, why that is interesting is that thanks to this, we can explore synchronization phenomena. Of course, if we just have periodic or stochastic elements, we cannot do very much with them. And in particular, I'm interested in the physical realization of these devices as opposed to simple numerical simulation, not because I think it is generally preferable, of course, but because I think it is relatively underexplored and is interesting from some viewpoints, for example, the consequences of non-idealities, parametric mismatches, and so on and so forth. So first of all, we will look at some circuits that I introduced for chaos generation, and we have my earliest baby step in this slide. This is a circuit that looks by all standards very trivial and innocuous, but actually it is far from that. Because as we change, for example, this resistance or this voltage, and we treat them as control parameters, we observe a rather rich bifurcation structure, accompanied by a fine-grained structure in the chaotic regions. If we look inside these regions, we see that there are qualitatively distinguishable behaviors. For example, the generation of volleys of activity that have fluctuating amplitudes or completely irregular amplitudes. Now, that immediately brings to mind some recordings of post-synaptic potentials that have been obtained in neurophysiology for decades. Have I obtained a neuron? Well, according to recent trends of calling everything a neuron, I would have said so, but of course that would be very dishonest intellectually. Clearly, this has nothing to do with a neuron, because the electrical magnitudes in this circuit have nothing to do with the physical variables involved in a neuron. But that is exactly the point. The point that is interesting is that we get phenomena that are to some extent qualitatively similar even in systems that have nothing to do with each other. And that celebrates why it is interesting to study nonlinear dynamics across different disciplines. We don't have design principles for these circuits. However, as my work showed, it is possible to discover a huge number of them using, for example, a large-scale genetic search. And we could get circuits such as this one here, which also has nothing to do with a neuron, but as you can see, it generates a train of all or nothing spikes that is surely, at least to some extent, reminiscent of presynaptic activity. One can also get very high-dimensional dynamics by injecting some structural complexity in these systems, for example, via fractal resonators, shown here, that are loosely inspired by the fractal organization of dendritic trees. I won't bore you with details, but it is also possible to realize these circuits in a pure CMOS implementation that is very well versed for ultra-low power engineering applications, for example, in reservoir computing. And the point I want to make here is that we have a very elementary circuit, and as a function of the control parameters, the same circuit can generate signals as diverse as a spike train with some level of power law scaling or 1/f type noise. In addition, one can consider arrays such as the one shown here that are 2D arrays of excitable units, in this case a simple gas discharge tube, a neon lamp, and interesting things can be seen. For example, the emergence of first-order phase transitions between two states and close to this point, the hallmarks of a second-order phase transition. Now, very interestingly, there are a number of statistical properties that are very similar to what we observe in vitro recordings of neuronal activity in terms of the scaling exponents of this activity. And I'm not showing it in this presentation, but with recent work, we were also able to determine a very interesting effect of global inhibitory feedback based on this setup, which we later discovered in realistic neural models. And in addition, one can, to some extent, mimic synapses using, for example, memory stores. Okay, that's the first point. So the first point tells us that it can be interesting to try to study side by side these kind of very different entities. But of course, we want to create networks. Now, a very simple type of network is a ring, of course, because it has a high degree of symmetry, which can be broken by the parametric heterogeneities or tolerances or non-idealities that you get in physical systems. And in this context, this leads for critical values of coupling to the emergence of a multi-scale community structure, which is quite fascinating because it recalls, at least to some extent, what we get in brain networks. And when we go to see the signals that drive these communities, they have interesting properties, which in some cases look loosely similar to an EEG. We can also create a more elaborate system that generates remote synchronization phenomena, whereby along a ring, we have strong synchronization for short distances, then loss of synchronization, and then recovery. A very strange, almost absurd effect that could be explained via an intricate modulation, the demodulation effect, completely self-organized. What is fun about this is that when we perturb this system, for example, by injecting a noise that obliterates a node, in some cases we just get local desynchronization. In some cases, we get a strong synchronizing effect, which is a paradoxical observation that loosely reminds us of what we observe, for example, following DBS-type interventions. And in addition, we can try to inject small rhythmic perturbations and do time-locked averaging a la ERP, and observe that the system responds, but strictly does not propagate them, showing an incredible level of selectivity, which is again something that has been observed neurophysiologically, for example, using the perturbational complexity index. And one can do a number of additional things that I will skip here in the interest of time. One interesting topic is the relationship between connectivity and dynamics. So what are the dynamics of the highly connected nodes? And there are a variety of ways of addressing it. And a number of, again, paradoxical and so very interesting observations, such as situations where you create a network where increasing the coupling actually has a non-monotonic effect on the synchronization, and the situations where you get the emergence of chimera states, which, as you know very well, are interesting, for example, as models of unihemispheric sleep. I just check the time. Okay, I will try to converge very quickly. Applications. In the context of neuroscience, this is an interesting playing ground to develop new measures. For example, one can develop toy models like this one, where one observes the generation of large amplitude, low frequency fluctuations in the hubs, similar to what we observe in fMRI, even though the network has nothing to do with it. And a number of comparisons can be made. These can be used then as a ground to develop new synchronization measures, such as a measure called warped phase synchronization that we developed a few years ago, based on these signals, and then applied to EEG, obtaining a considerable improvement of performance in BCI. Why is it interesting? Well, first, because we have a ground truth. Of course, we know the structure of the system. And second, because we can manipulate it very easily. Other applications include the generation of spatiotemporal rhythms to drive complex robots, such as this insect here, and the integration of these things. Other applications in engineering include distributed sensing, so realizing these kind of interactions wirelessly and using them to solve a sensing problem where you want to measure not from individual nodes, but, for example, the average or the variance of a value, which can also be implemented in a realistic scenario using microwave links. And of course, reservoir computing. Reservoir computing is shown here in a small networks of those spiking neurons that can exhibit a number of non-trivial effects, such as, again, the non-monotonic relationships between coupling and synchronization, and competition effects. And we can generate simple reservoirs that operate at very low power and can help with classification problems. At last, a fun application that I've been exploring on a number of data, including EEG, is data augmentation, where you have these kind of systems and you perturb or disturb them using external signals, such as EEG or an accelerometer, and these act as transformers, helping to transform nonlinear features into linear ones, leading to very much richer spectrograms, as shown here on the right, that can aid to solve classification problems. What I'm working on right now here at UESTC is the integration of all these concepts together, in particular also collaborating with Pedro to try to get new ideas for biomarkers grounded on all these concepts. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention. I apologize, it was a little bit rushed, but I just wanted to give you a flavor. If any of you is interested in all this, you are very warmly welcome to contact me. You have my email address and my WeChat QR code here. Thank you very much.
Okay, first of all, hi everyone. I'm Yuri Antonacci from University of Palermo. I want first of all to say thank you to Professor Ludovico Minati for inviting me in this interesting topic and session. Okay, and today I'm going to give you a perspective from the point of view of information theory to better elucidate how complex interaction in the brain can be studied. So first of all, how is it important to study human brain? Because, for example, we can prevent and monitor neurological disease and also develop some new strategies to rehabilitate the brain. However, what we usually do is to map the human brain as a network where we have nodes representing the different brain areas and some edges that map in some way the interaction among the different brain regions. So what is the problem with the network representation? We know that we are able only to capture the pairwise interaction, while it is well acknowledged now how in the human brain there are higher order interaction as a result of emergent properties. So we have interaction that can involve more than two nodes. So what we can do is to exploit the information dynamics that has been extensively employed also in not only neuroscience but in physiology, to try to elucidate and better describe how this higher order interaction can be estimated. So what we can do is to explore the brain network by starting from multi-channel EEG. We can either extract EEG time series that are representative of the EEG brain dynamics, or after pre-processing, we can use EEG signal and then perform some different analysis to compute, for example, univariate analysis measure like the entropy, the conditional entropy, or information storage. Bivariate measure such as mutual information, cross entropy and transfer entropy, and also a multivariate analysis like the joint entropies, conditional mutual information, or conditional transfer entropy. So what we are trying to do is to introduce a unified framework for a characterization of the brain dynamics at different order of interaction in time and in frequency domain. So first of all, what we can do, we can represent the activity of the brain dynamics like a stochastic process in which we have co-random processes that are interacting, and we can we can extract from this dynamic process different time series. Then we can sample this time series to extract a random variable that sampling the present time of the system, and a random variable that samples the past state of the process. Under the assumption that these two random variables are identically distributed and the process is stationary, what we can do is to introduce different information theoretic concepts, starting from that are very useful to study the interaction at different order. For example, we start from interaction of order 1 throughout the entropy rate that is used in the literature as a complexity measure, which means that the higher is the entropy rate, the higher is the complexity of the brain dynamics. And we can move towards the interaction of order 2 throughout the mutual information rate that is basically a measure of dynamic coupling that can be decomposed as 3 different entropy rate terms. Then we can move with the interaction of order greater or equal than 3 throughout the introduced concept framework of information rate. So what we can see here, for example, if we have 3 interactive processes, we have the information rate that is equal to the mutual information between the mutual information rate between x3 and x1 plus the mutual information rate between x3 and x2 minus the joint mutual information rate. And this is can be generalized for a number of processes up to the number of processes that are present in the network to account for higher order interaction. In particular, the sign of the information rate reflects the redundancy or the synergistic contribution of the interaction. For example, the redundancy is present in the network if the 2 sources share more information with the target when they are considered individually. On the other hand, the synergy arises when the 2 sources sharing more information with the target when they are considered jointly, which means that there is a plus of information that I can unveil in the network. So, how to compute all these measures? We can perform the frequency domain expansion of this framework, starting from the computation of the power spectral density matrix. And in particular, we can define a spectral measure of entropy rate that is basically a logarithmic version of the power spectral density. The spectral mutual information rate we have, it is dependent from the auto spectra and the cross spectra of the 2 processes that I'm considering, and then I can also compute the information rate in the frequency domain by starting from the mutual information rate as a basic as a basis of the composition. Then, throughout the well-known spectral integral property of all the information theoretic measure, we can also integrate this spectral information measure to obtain again a time domain version of this measure. This is very useful, especially for the study of the brain, because I can integrate my information theoretic measure only in the alpha beta frequency band, or the band in which I'm most interested. So, how to compute the power spectral density? Then you know that there is basically two ways. One based on the vector-Euler regressive model with the linear parametric approach, and the other one by simply computing the weighted covariance matrix. So, how can we study the different interaction in the brain? We start from the interaction of order 1. Here we have a motor execution task in 10 healthy subjects, where was asked to each subject to perform a motor task execution in which the subject close and open the right fist. And basically we selected at the scalp level 3 different group of process, X1, X2, X3, that are related to, is supposed to be related to the supplementary motor area and to the 2 different primary motor cortex, the ipsilateral one, X2, and the contralateral one. What we can see here is that if we perform an analysis of the spectral entropy rate, there is a decreasing of the complexity over the beta frequency band during the motor task execution that is more evident in the contralateral hemisphere. However, if we integrate these measures over alpha, beta, and over the whole frequency spectrum, you can see that there is, in the whole frequency spectrum, we cannot able to see any differences. Instead, if we look, for example, at the beta frequency band, there is a statistically significant decreasing. So this is reasonable because, for example, if we think about the fact that the spectral entropy rate is a logarithmic version of the power spectral density matrix, this decreasing can be related to the Moore rhythm desynchronization. Then we can move towards the study at the scalp level of the interaction of order 2 and of order 3 in particular. Here we have an extension of the previous study in which were enrolled 109 healthy subjects. The task was the same, but basically what we did here is to compute the OIR at order 3, that is equal to the interaction information rate, by starting from the 3 different mutual information rate terms that I previously introduced, by also computing also the spectral version of this measure. Then what we can see here is that the selection has been performed throughout a selection of X1 and X2, the two sources, towards the ipsilateral hemisphere related to the premotor cortex and to the motor cortex, and as a target, the 3 channels that are related mostly with the contralateral hemisphere. What we can see is that there is a statistically significant redundant contribution with a prominent peak in both the 2 conditions, rest and task, and there is also a decreasing in the beta frequency band of the interaction information rate, which means that the 3 processes, the information that is shared between the 3 processes is decreasing. So if we integrate again this measure over the alpha and beta frequency band, we can see that, for example, here there is a decreasing that is statistically significant of the coupling between them, the mutual information rate, for example, between Y and X1, and also of the mutual information rate that is jointly shared between Y and the 2 sources taken together. So what we did then, we tried to do the same analysis, in particular, on the motor network at the source level. And in particular, we selected 10 healthy subjects performing an end grip motor task, and we assumed that the results that we previously obtained at the scalp level, in some sense, can be reproduced at the source level. After a simple EEG preprocessing to remove artifact and so on, we performed a source reconstruction through our ILORETA approach, and we selected only 5 ROIs within the motor network. Then, after the computation through our vector autoregressive model of the information rate, we have a complete description of the motor task execution starting from the order 1 up to order 5, which is the number of the ROIs that we selected. So basically, what we can see here is that left and right premotor cortex and the supplementary motor areas are related with the preparation of the movement. The movement initiation and execution of the movement involve all the brain areas. And what we can see here, for example, in the case of entropy rates, also in this case, we have a confirmation of decreasing of complexity of the brain dynamics during performing a motor task execution that is present in both alpha and beta frequency band, even if the number reported here at the bottom of the figure represents the number of the subject for which the measure is statistically significant. So if you can see from the bottom, there is a higher number of subjects in which in the alpha frequency band the complexity is above the threshold. So by looking at the order 2, the mutual information rate, the pairwise interaction, we can see that there is a statistically significant dynamic coupling between different cortical areas where anatomical connection have been observed, for example, in primates, and also a statistically significant decrease in the strength of this pairwise interaction. So we have a decreasing of complexity that is accompanied by a decreasing on the coupling between the different brain areas. If we look instead at the higher order interaction, we can see that from order 3 to order 5, there is a decreasing of the OIR, which means that there is an increasing of the OIR, which means that there is more redundancy in the brain network. And in particular, if we look at the order 3, the only 2 different triplets in which there is a statistically significant decreasing, as you can see from the figure on the left, are these 2 triplets involving the ipsilateral ipsilateral premotor cortex and contralateral premotor and motor cortex. So to conclude, the application to EEG signal at the scalp and sensor level and at the scalp sensor level and at the cortical level demonstrated that the motor task execution can be associated with a decrease in the complexity of the brain dynamics that we can relate with the well-known mood desynchronization. There is also a decoupling in both ipsilateral and contralateral motor networks that can be the results of the suppressive influence of the supplementary motor areas, and also there are higher order behavior because we saw a decrease in the Hoyle values as a result of this hierarchical interaction between different brain regions that are anatomically connected. So I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'm here for questions if you have.
Okay. In the interest of time, we will move on to the final talk. Sorry, apologies. We are in a very strict sort of a schedule, trying to align with the other breakout room as well. And so I believe we move on to Professor Christophe Letellier. And so if you wouldn't mind sharing your screen now, please, and we can move into your talk. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the invitation. So here it's a more theoretical approach about the control of chaotic system when they are coupled. This work was made with Irene Sendina-Nadal from Madrid in Spain, Ludovico Minati from Chengdu, and Jean-Pierre Barbeau, a guy from the control theory in École Normale de Nantes. So basically my contribution is based on three concepts. Global observability, which means that in fact, when we measure a variable in a system, we require to have a full knowledge about the variables that are not measured. And this is not always guaranteed. And this is why we have to investigate the observability of the system through the variable that is measured. And when we have the full knowledge of the states, then we say that we have global observability. I will come back on that later. The driver of this is a global controllability. In fact, depending on where you apply your actuator in the system, you have a partial or a global controllability. Of course, if you want to have a very good control to the desired behavior, you need to have a global controllability. And in fact, I will explain you briefly that global observability is the dual of global controllability, and they are interrelated. And when you have these two first states, you can hope to be able to construct what we have, what we call a flat control law. So flatness, it means it's a very particular way of rewriting the system and to be able to construct an efficient control law based on an optimal placement of sensor for having global observability, actuators for having global controllability. And there is an additional condition that I will briefly mention with an example. So first, we have to assess the observability, and it can be done as a first approximation, starting from a fluence graph. Fluence graph, you start from the governing equation. Here, there are the Rosler system, and you start with the first derivative. And in fact, you introduce an arrow from y to x because y influences the rate of change of x. That is, it's the derivative of x. And this is the same for z. In that case, it's two linear interactions, so it's solid line. Second equation, we have the interaction between x and y, so it's still linear. And for the fluence graph, we do not consider a self-interaction of the variable with itself. And for the third equation, here we have a nonlinear term that is represented here by a dashed line. And what is very important to understand is that when we have a nonlinear connection between two variables, as in between x and z, this means that we have somewhere a lack of information. And this means that we have a lack of observability in the system. For instance, from here, we already know that recording variable z will not be the optimal case because the information coming from x is through a nonlinear coupling. So basically, to identify the optimal transfer of information, we remove nonlinear coupling, and then we work with a reduced fluent graph made of the sole linear coupling. So in that case, we are able to construct what we call an observability path that visits all the variables with linear solid edges. So for the Rossler system, it means that we have an observability path from Z to X to Y. At the end of that path, sorry, I started in the opposite. From the beginning of that path, this is the place where the information starts to flow through the system. So this is the place to place the actuator. And in fact, the derivative of Z will provide a global controllability. At the end of the observability path, this is where all the information through the system arrive. And then this is the variable that you will choose to measure. And this variable will provide global observability. So then it can be rigorously, analytically proved. So here is what we have with this. Sorry, I'm trying to remove this bar, but I cannot. Okay, so we have the Jacobian matrix, we have the fluence graph, and we have the observability path, where in this case, we know where to put the actuator and the sensor. So we can check that we have a global observability. So basically, we can construct the observability matrix and blah, blah, blah. I skip the mathematical detail. If you want to have them, I can write me and I will send them to you. And so here in that case, we are measuring variable Y, and it provides a global observability. Then, when we have the actuator placed on the derivative of Z, this means that we have the placement vector J, which is 0, 0, 1 as a component. We can prove, once we compute the controllability matrix, that its determinant is never vanishing. And then this is the additional condition for flatness. We measure variable Y, and we will use its successive derivatives to reconstruct the state space. And basically, each time we compute a derivative, when we take the observability path here, computing a derivative starting from Y means that we skip to the next variable when we reverse the observability path. So the first derivative of Y allows us to reach variable X. And the second one allows us to reach the variable Z. This is where we place the actuator. And the actuator should be reached when we have finished to reconstruct the state space. So here we have a global observability, so we can hope to be able to reconstruct the dynamics in a space that has the same dimension than the original state space. In the case of the Rossler system, it's 3. So the variable measured and its 2 successive derivatives, we have a dimension 3, and we reach the actuator with the second derivative. This is why this condition is non-zero, and this is the condition we require to have a flat control law. So basically, now we have to construct the actuating signal. So here, this is the most how to say that, develop rigorous approach, feedback linearization. Basically, the first 3 terms represent a stabilization of the system with the difference between the variable of the control system and those that is measured as a desired behavior. The same for the first derivative, the same for the second derivatives. And here, this is in fact the term for the third derivative that cancel the dynamics of the control system to replace it with the desired one. And so here we need to compute from the governing equation this polynomial that corresponds to the third derivative of the variable Y. So this is a quite complex way to construct a control law, the flat control law, but I will show you that it's very efficient. So now I will use directly, to skip time, to use as a drive signal the variable x of the renormalized Lorentz system. Because when you want to control a system, if the two systems have first two different range of for the amplitude of oscillation, that doesn't work because you can eject the trajectory to infinity. That means the trajectory of the produced by the control system. Second, basically, they should oscillate more or less at the same frequency. Otherwise, the control system cannot be able to follow fast oscillation, for instance, of the drive system. That's why here I use a renormalized Lorentz system, which has more or less the same range of amplitude as the variable Z, no, variable Y of the Rossler system. That's a measured variable in the Rossler system, and basically the same frequency. So here it's a free Rossler system. It's dynamic, so it's a typical spiral Rossler attractor. And here it's a flat control Rossler system. So here in this first panel, you recognize the Lorentz system projected in XY plane. This is because X and Y are related in a very linear way in the Rossler system, more or less as in the Lorentz system. But of course, when you use a Z variable, which is related to the first two variables in the Rossler system in a completely different way than from the Lorentz system, we have, of course, an attractor that doesn't look like the Lorentz attractor. But if you compute, if you perform a topological characterization, you will have the same dynamics as for the Lorentz system. So with this, we can show that the control Rossler system produces also a Lorentz dynamics as the drive system. So the next step is, because of course it's not so trivial case, but it's quite easy case. Now it's to consider as a first step for considering a network of chaotic system, two coupled, diffusely coupled Rossler system by the Y variable. The choice of the Y variable has two inputs. First, we would like to have the possibility to have the synchronization between the two coupled system, and we have to use a variable that allows the good transmission of the information from one system to the other. And here, in that case, we choose a variable providing the global observability. Here is the fluence graph of these two coupled Rossler system. And from this, we can construct this observability path. So here you see that basically you can choose to measure, theoretically, variable Y2 or variable Y1. It doesn't matter too much. We choose, in fact, to measure two variables because we proved analytically that it's not possible to reconstruct this dyad of Rossler system by measuring only a single variable. And we choose to measure the two variables in the same system. Here it's a case of X2 and Y2. So if we construct the observability path, now we have two observability paths, one from Z1 to Y2 and one from Z2 to X2. You remember when we compute the successive derivative, it's like going conversely to the observability path. So if I compute the first derivative of Y2, I reach Y1, second X1, and here I already also reach Z2. And in principle, I should reach the first actuator before the second one. So this cannot work to construct a flat control load. And so there is a trick, which is far from being trivial, is to add an additional variable, W, and which is very related. In fact, it works as an integrator. And this W allows to reach the second actuator at the same time, at the same derivative of Y2. This allows to construct a flat control law in that case. So my system now is 7-dimensional. I have an additional variable for integrate the actuator, and I can show with the same tools than before that I can have a flat control law. And okay, so I construct feedback linearization, and I have two measured variables, X2 and Y2, and two actuators. So here it's the first a variable measure, and it's this actuating signal for the first actuator. And the second one, this is X2, and here the actuating signal. And here there is another trick, because when I measure the dynamics in a different system than the control system, for instance, here I have a parameter mismatch between the two Rosler systems, I have to make coherent the second variable measured with the first one, but with the dynamics of the control system. This is why, in fact, the second variable, I don't measure it directly, but I reconstruct it according to the governing equation and the control system. This is the trick. So here is a block diagram of the control system. And here is the results. So I have two Rosler systems with a parameter mismatch. One is producing a spiral Rosler attractor, the second one a funnel Rosler attractor. And I drive that with the paired 4 limit cycle produced by the drive Rosler. And with the correct control parameter value, you see that I have almost a perfect control of the two different systems by measuring only a single one. So I can replace the drive signal by the Lorentz dynamics. And again, I'm able to have the dyad of a Rosler system reproducing the Lorentz dynamics with that type of control. So it works, perfect. So now let's try to apply that for a random network. This is a random network made of 28 nodes. And here I will explain a little bit better why the first step was to control a dyad. Because to have a global observability of a nonlinear network, and here when I'm speaking about global observability, I'm using a nonlinear theory. And already for such a network, it's not possible to observe the whole network with a single node measure. Forget it. Even if the nodes are connected in a linear way. Why? It's because the nodal dynamics is nonlinear. So you need absolutely to have a nonlinear approach to assess the global observability. And I should add that in that case, we have an analytical proof that we have a global observability. And in fact, we remark that we can measure in one node, and in that case, we are able to reconstruct two nodes, not three. Three, it's impossible for a Rosler system. So that means that we group the node of the network by a pair, 13 in fact, and in that case, we control this pair, the network, by controlling the pair of the network. That's why I started with the dyad. So I will use two values of the coupling strength. First one, it's a very low coupling strength for which we don't have synchronization. And the second one, for which we don't have perfect synchronization, but we are close to synchronization. Here we have two dissolute curves to show the difference between these two coupling strengths. And you will see that this coupling strength is very important for spreading the control through the network. So with coupling, so here I have my 28 nodes, and blue square, this is a control pair of nodes. And this one, you can remark that it's already synchronized with the two control one. But of course, the rest is not synchronized. I had a control node, a control pair, and of course, the control pair is also synchronized with the drive signal. And I continue like that, adding pair. And you see that the drive signal has difficulty to be spread over the network when we had a control pair, but it's only partial. So basically, when the coupling strength is too small, I cannot be able to control actually the system on the desired signal because the coupling strength is too low. I should have pairs to better control the system. So let me reproduce that experiment, but with a greater coupling strength. Again, as soon as I switch, I control a first pair, I have this green square where the node is already controlled, and then I start to add other pair to be controlled. And here we see with 3, I have already a nice effect on the whole network which reduce the dynamics toward the period 4 drive signal. And I had a 4th one, 5th one, 6th one. Here it's almost rich to have controlled the network. And here you see that with a slightly greater coupling strength, I'm able to control the whole network without controlling any node, every node, so all the nodes. So now we are in a global brain component consortium. So what happens when I replace the Rossler dynamics by a model for the neuron? Here, this is the equation of the Maurice-Lecar model for neurons. And the fluence graph is here. Everything is nonlinear. So here, from here, I already know that no observability path, no global observability, and it's not possible to make it flat. So finished. The single neuron is not flat controllable. So as soon as I will have a network of these neurons, that will be very complicated to control that network. Replace the Maurice-Lecar model by the Fitzhugh-Nagumo models, which is simpler. And when I compute, I draw the fluence graph, everything is linear. Wait. So in that case, I'm able to construct an observability path from W to V. And here I already switched to a dyad of globally Fitzhugh-Nagumo systems. And I can show analytically that my observability matrix has a rank determinant that never vanishes, meaning that I have a global observability. It's the same for the controllability matrix. So the dyad is globally controllable. And I can check that the condition for flatness is also fulfilled. So yes, theoretically, a dyad of neuron is flat controllable. And this is our next experiments on the desk. A third model is in Marshall's model. It's 3-dimensional. And the fluence graph, basically, it looks like the Rossler one, but the variables are not exactly the same. I have an observability path from Y to X to Z. And so I check that when the two in Marshall's system are Y coupled, then the dyad is globally observable and it's globally controllable. And the flatness condition is also fulfilled. So in principle, I should be able to control a dyad of neurons. That means that most likely networks of in Marshall's system is also flat controllable. So as a conclusion, global flatness is a combination of global observability and global controllability, plus the possibility to express the actuating signal from the measurements and their derivative. I show you that I can control a flat system to any desired dynamics. I show you that in the case of the Rossler system, that, for instance, can produce a Lorentz attractor, but you can put what you want as a drive signal. And I also show you that a flat control of two Y diffusely coupled Rossler system, this is not trivial, but it's possible to do. And a differential delay must be added. This is an additional variable to produce an integrator of the actuating signal that I added. And this was realized as an electronic experiment by Ludovico. And a random network was successfully controlled, also 28 nodes, but we are working at the moment for the extension, 100 nodes, 200, and it still works. It's not yet published, but forthcoming. And of course, the quality of the control depends on the coupling strength and on the number of control terms. And such a random network should be successfully controlled when the nodal dynamic is either a Fitzhugh-Nagumo or in Marshall's model, but not, definitely not when it's a Maurice-Lecar model. just a few things. I published a book about chaos in nature. This is about the history of chaos, roughly. And also with Otto Rossler, I edited a book he wrote in the 80s and he never published. And this was published in 2020. Thank you very much for your attention.
I just want to jump in to say thank you for a really splendid talk. I think even though it is not neurophysiology sensu stricto, it gives a lot of inspiration to all of us who are working on neural modeling in various ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you, Ludovico, and thank you, Professor Letellier. A really fantastic talk. 3 great talks here. I've been informed that we actually have a few minutes for discussion. It's a rarity. The other symposium is running over by a few minutes, which means that we can spend a little bit more time sort of with discussion. So if anybody has questions for any of our speakers, then certainly we can at least try to cover 1 or 2 of these questions in the meantime. So please feel free just to sort of speak up or post your question in the chat. So Ludovico, I'm going to just put you on the spot here. Maybe you can expand a little bit on the conversation with Ina in the sort of chat, which was very interesting, and for those who might not have seen that.
Yes. This is very nice. I think one of the key points is the meaning of the connections. Because right now, the approach that I've been working on is very much grounded on graphs. So bipartite associations. In reality, as we know very well, modulatory effects are at the heart of so many things in our brain. At the microscale, we have things like tripartite synapses, we have voltage-sensitive channels, etc., which make things so much more complex than pure summation. At the systems level, we get it all over the place, right? The thalamocortical interactions give many examples, but also top-down and bottom-up modulations of all sorts and flavors. What does that mean? That means that in order to capture these things with the circuits, we need to model this kind of effects, which calls for rather different electronics. Well, rather different. Some changes, because obviously you need the state of a third system to influence the coupling between other 2 systems. And that's what I've been working on very recently, until extremely recently, in fact. And now we will start more and more building networks of this type. Now, the spiking aspect is another story, because this can happen. This can be relevant in the context of a spiking network or not necessarily. That's orthogonal to that.
Thank you, Ludovico. I think Ina has a question in response to that. So Ina, go ahead.
It's not so much in response to that. I just wanted to raise another issue, but I just wanted to thank all the speakers, for this session. It was really, really fascinating. I just wanted to raise the question of the cerebellum, because that has 80% of the neurons in the central nervous system. And, we're doing battle with 20% of the neurons in the central nervous system with the cerebral cortex. And even then we're having trouble. But I just wanted to raise that, because when Professor Minati was talking about the modulatory effects, you were mentioning subcortical structures and cortical interactions, but there's the cerebellum as well.
Absolutely so, and it's very interesting how little we know it across scales. Because, I mean, at the microscale, Purkinje cells are so unique in their phenotype, and yet we model them using fairly vanilla tools, as far as I know, at least, just like another variety of neurons, just like pyramidal neurons. But in fact, they are pretty different. And at the systems level, I mean, it is almost scandalous. You're right. Across all the studies with fMRI, yes, and we find some cerebellar activation. Yes, and we consistently ignore it.
Yeah.
I think you are absolutely right. The cerebellum is an elephant in the room that we are totally neglecting. Yeah.
Yeah, and I just wanted to mention that I just came back from Biomag in Australia, and so there was a, a talk by Samuelson, and of course Samuelson et al. Originally did a theoretical modeling of activity in the cerebellum, putting in a dipole, and then just looking at where on this at the sensor level. In MEG and also EG, we might be able to see activity, and it's possible. And so they also presented they had a talk at Biomag as well about, recording cerebellar activity. So this is something I think we can do, and I think that, we should start, really thinking about.
Definitely. Very definitely so.
Mhm. Fantastic. Okay, thank you all. So I think now we will be wrapping up. We're going back into the main screen, and we will say our goodbyes there. So we'll see you shortly in the main screen.